So we just left off on cleaning up all this plastic gauge, put assembly lube on all the bearings, get the cap back on, retorque them, and then we'll move on to dressing the pistons.
So this is the assembly lube that I was using. It's just something I had left over from a previous project. So you're gonna just spread that in your bearings, spread it all around, make sure everything's good and lubed. Assembly lube is a little bit more sticky, so that way it hangs around for longer, so that way you can avoid dry starts. Now you're gonna put in your main caps, making sure that you have them in correct order and they're oriented in the right direction. So here I'm just putting some assembly lube because it's so sticky. I'm using it to hold my thrust bearings on, so I'm not fighting them because I was fighting them previously before that. Finish installing the rest of the main bearings, and then I'm going to use a speed wrench to make sure that I get them to go down evenly and that I don't run into any binding or anything and that the threads are clean. And then we're going to go through here and torque them to the correct torque specifications. And then now we're going through and cleaning all of our bearing surfaces for our rod bearings, and now we're going to move on to assembling the rods. Now here I'm showing you is to install the bearings. You want to make sure that you line them up with the tang. This right here is showing that there's a hole in the bearing and that it's lined up to the oil squirter that sprays up into the piston walls, so it helps lubricate the cylinder as it's running. This is also showing where there's an orientation for your rod caps, so that way you're installing those correctly. And then now what I'm doing is for myself as a reference is I'm marking different locations on the pistons where I'm placing my oil rings, and then I'll do the same thing for the combustion rings. You want to make sure that you stagger everything out, because if you have them all in line, you'll run into issues where you'll just have a bunch of blow by and it'll go straight into your crank. You don't want that. So that's why if you look at the instructions for installing rings, it'll explain to you to make sure like to orient it a certain way. Yeah, here we slow down. It's hard work. Got sweat on the eyebrows. Had to clean that off. So now we're back at it, and it's always good to have a loose vise around in case you need a third hand. This has worked great because I was struggling just before that and remembered, oh yeah, I have a vise that I can just bring over here that was already on my welding bench before this. So, yep, I got that in, and now we're just gonna blast through getting the rest of these done. So now that we have our pistons dressed, the next thing is to install them into the block. So I'm using a universal ring compressor here. So what you want to do is tap the ring compressor down, make sure it's firmly against your block and there's no gap. You're going to retighten it to make sure that your rings are all the way compressed, and then you're going to lightly tap it down carefully because you don't want to damage your rings. It's very easily to damage the rings using a universal one. So you want to make sure everything's perfect. And then as you saw, I reached down there and guided the rod the rest of the way down and let it into where it's supposed to sit, so that way I didn't damage our freshly polished surface on the crank that we did here at home. Again, we're doing all of this with our basic hand tools in our at-home garage. So once that's done, we're just moving on to the other piston that's in the same has the crank in the same location, and then it's just rinse and repeat. Move the crank to where you need it each time. Go down. I go ahead and I put the rod cap bearing on at this time. Instead of flipping the whole motor, it's the route that I chose to do. You could do individuals and keep rotating it upside down. But now that we have them all in, we're moving on to our plasti gauge. We're going to be sitting here plasti gauging each one of our rod bearings. So I'm going to be pulling the caps, putting in a piece of plasti gauge, torquing it down, and then we'll pull the caps back off and use our little piece of paper with all the measurements on it to get our generic or what it can provide for us as a reading on our bearing clearances. But once again, as you're going through this, you're just going to be continuously, it's just rinse and repeat. I'm going to take care of these two rods. I'm going to rotate the motor a little bit and do it again on another two rods, rotate the motor again, and do it on the last two rods. It's just rinse and repeat until you've completed this process all the way through. Make sure that you always clean your plastic gauge off when you're done, and use your assembly lube after you've completed it on top of that too. Um, you see there that I'm checking it, making sure that we're within our tolerances. Off the side, I'm on the oil pound surface. I'm using the Sharpie again to write down all my clearances so I can go back and look at them. and know what they are. So there I push the rod down a little bit. It helps the assembly lube get down into the all the way around the crank, so we have assembly lube firmly, evenly spread across it. It's just not on the cap when we do this, to help make sure that we don't cause any issues, damage, or spin a bearing while we're just turning this over by hand. And then as you can see, I struggled with this one, and I don't know why I didn't just grab my dead blow and just hit the rod where the bolts come out. Instead, I just thought, like, not thinking, let me just use my screwdriver, which worked just fine. I didn't damage anything, but you'll see later in the video, I go back to, like, back and forth to using the dead blow, and I don't know what my thought process was. I literally just wasn't thinking, and I don't know why I didn't just tap them down. So, yep, using the screwdriver there, putting everything. Now we're doing our final torque on these rods. Once you've completed all 6, also go through, rotate the motor, and recheck all your torques. Make sure you didn't miss anything. Another thing that you'll be watching for as you're going through and doing this is at any point while you're torquing all of this stuff down is if the motor becomes harder to turn, then you probably have a bearing that is binding or an issue that's going on, right? Is the whole time you're assembling one of these motors, when you're doing this process, is it shouldn't start binding. So you're constantly, as you're adding more and more parts and torquing more and more stuff down, keep rotating the motor and making sure that you haven't picked up any binds and added drag or any issues going on, right? Because as you go through steps, it's going to be easier to figure out where your binding is at, instead of assembling, all your rods at once and torquing everything down at the same time, and then you don't know which one it was. So as you rotated it for every 2, you know it was one of the 2 if you run into a binding issue, right, or excessive drag. So that's another thing to keep in mind as you're doing this, is to always watch if you start getting excessive drag or the motor becomes harder to turn than it should. Like I said, all I'm doing is just running it through its paces right there and verifying, and then I also realized that as I was trying to put my crank bolt in, it was kind of difficult, so I'm cleaning out the threads and make sure everything's good there, just for when we're ready for final assembly. Now we're going to throw the oil pump in, because we have finished installing all of our bearings and everything, and we're moving on to assembly of a short block. And this is our brand new oil pump.
Man, my hair's all crazy. Oh well. I'm gonna start off update. So I've gone ahead, cleaned up the this front cover, removed the seals. Even knowing all those seals were, had like 500 miles on them, I figured, maybe. And I had to take this off last time I changed the seal out. I changed it out in here. Anyways, I cleaned this all up. Something I learned when I was working on forklifts is because we'd have problems with these gaskets spitting out. This style of gasket, these round ones. If you take this high-tack gasket sealer and you place it on the outside, it makes them a little harder to get out, but you don't have to worry about them spitting out or leaking around them if you have a little bit of a scored mark or something in here on the seats. So yeah, this stuff's pretty good. And then just a wire wheel and parts cleaner, it comes right off, no problem. It's just getting them out. But honestly, it doesn't make them that much harder to get out. They're pretty easy. So anyways, this thing's ready to go on. I gotta re-wipe down the head of the block. Still gotta clean the front here a little bit more. I got like a pre-scraped everything. I'm gonna wire wheel it a little bit, clean it, make sure it's dry, and we'll get the new gaskets for the front here. RTV them on, place the front gasket on. We'll do a straight edge across the deck here to make sure that the front plate's even with the deck of the motor. Maybe do the head first and then the oil pan maybe. Just going to be going through on cleaning up some of the RTV on some of the stuff here. Like here, I'll have to clean up the gasket for the water neck. Pretty much down to the last of it, where we'll get this assembled and then get it timed, the rest of the covers on, and stuff it back in the car, which I mean is a workbench kind of at the moment.